The conference room felt smaller than usual that afternoon. The mahogany walls seemed in to close in as I sat across from the estate lawyer reviewing the final changes to my will. I had built my life carefully, brick by brick, investment by investment, and now at 72 years old, I was ensuring everything would pass smoothly to the next generation. My son deserved it all. He had always been dutiful, respectful, and now, with his beautiful wife expecting their first child, I wanted to make certain their future was secure. The lawyer slid the updated documents across the polished table. I signed my name with the gold fountain pen my late husband had given me 40 years ago. Everything felt right. Everything felt complete. I gathered my papers into my leather portfolio and walked out into the gleaming lobby, my heels clicking against the marble floor with the satisfaction of a task well done. That's when I heard it, the voice I had come to know so well over the past 3 years, the voice that called me mother with such warmth, the voice that had sung lullabies to my unborn grandchild just last week at our family dinner. She was standing near the elevator bank, her back to me, phone pressed to her ear, completely unaware of my presence. The words stopped me cold. Mission accomplished. The old woman signed everything over. By this time next year, we'll have control of the entire estate, and then we can finally be free of her constant interference. My blood turned to ice in my veins. My portfolio slipped slightly in my grip, the leather creaking in the silence that followed her statement. I stood frozen, hidden partially behind a marble column, my mind refusing to process what my ears had just heard. She laughed then, a sound I had never heard from her before, sharp and calculating, nothing like the gentle laugh she used in my presence. The next words were even worse. She told someone on the other end of that call that the pregnancy announcement had been perfectly timed, that my son had no idea about any of this, that I was exactly the kind of sentimental fool they had counted on me being. Before the story begins, please leave us a comment telling us which state or city you are watching from. Do not forget to like and subscribe so this channel can grow and bring you more exciting stories. That afternoon in the lawyer's office should have been one of satisfaction and peace. Instead, it became the moment that shattered my entire world. I had spent 3 years welcoming this woman into my family. 3 years believing she loved my son as much as I did. 3 years thinking I had finally gained the daughter I never had. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday celebration, every quiet afternoon of tea and conversation in my sunroom had been a performance. I was nothing more than a mark, a means to an end, an obstacle to be managed until my assets could be transferred. The elevator dinged and she stepped inside, still talking on her phone, still laughing about her successful manipulation. The doors closed and she vanished from view, but her words echoed in the vast lobby like a curse I could not escape. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my reflection staring back at me from the polished elevator doors. An old woman, elegantly dressed in my cream Chanel suit, pearls at my throat, silver hair perfectly styled, looking every bit the refined widow I had worked so hard to become. But inside, I felt hollow, betrayed, foolish. The doorman asked if I was all right, and I managed to nod, to smile, to walk through those doors with my head held high, because that is what 72 years of dignity demanded. My driver was waiting with the car, and I slid into the back seat, closing my eyes against the bright afternoon sun. The leather was cool against my skin, and the familiar scent of the car's interior usually brought me comfort. Today it smelled like defeat. I had been so careful my entire life. After my husband passed away 15 years ago, I had managed our considerable estate with precision and intelligence, growing the portfolio, making smart investments, ensuring that our legacy would continue for generations. I had raised my son to be kind and honest and hardworking. I had been so proud when he brought her home 3 years ago. This lovely young woman with her bright smile and her apparent devotion to him. She had seemed perfect. She had asked all the right questions about family history, had expressed such genuine interest in my late husband's business achievements, had volunteered to help me organize old photographs and documents. I thought she cared. I thought she wanted to understand where we came from. Now I understood she was simply cataloging assets, taking inventory, planning her takeover. The drive home took 20 minutes through tree-lined streets of the neighborhood where I had lived for 40 years. Each familiar landmark passed by my window like a ghost. The park where I used to take my son as a child, the restaurant where we celebrated his college graduation, the church where my husband's funeral had been held, where she had stood beside my son looking appropriately somber and supportive. All of it felt contaminated now by the truth I had accidentally discovered. When we pulled into the circular driveway of my home, a sprawling Tudor revival that my husband and I had purchased when our son was just a baby, I felt a strange disconnect. This was my sanctuary, my fortress, the physical manifestation of everything I had built and protected. Yet suddenly it felt vulnerable, exposed, like castle walls made of paper that any strong wind could tear down. I thanked my driver and walked up the stone steps to the front door. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. The roses my gardener had planted last spring were in full bloom, their fragrance heavy in the warm air. Everything looked exactly as it should. Everything looked peaceful and secure. But I knew better now. Inside, the house was quiet. My housekeeper had left for the day, and the silence wrapped around me like a shroud. I walked through the foyer with its chandelier that had cost more than most people's cars, past the living room with its antique furniture and original artwork, down the hall to my study. This had been my husband's room once, and after his death, I had made it mine, surrounding myself with the books and documents and memories of a life well lived. I set my portfolio on the desk and sank into the leather chair, my hands trembling for the first time since I had left the lawyer's office. The room smelled of old paper and lemon polish and the faint ghost of my husband's cologne, which I sometimes imagined I could still detect after all these years. On the wall hung his portrait, painted 2 years before his death, showing him in his prime at 55, distinguished and confident. I looked up at that portrait and wondered what he would tell me to do. He had always been the strategist, the chess player who thought 12 moves ahead. I had learned from him, had absorbed his lessons about business and people and the importance of protecting what you build. But I had also believed in the goodness of family, in the bonds that transcend money and property. I had been naive. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 5 times, marking the passage of another hour in a day that had fundamentally altered my understanding of my own life. I reached for the phone on my desk and then stopped. Who would I call? My son. The thought of telling him that his wife, the mother of his unborn child, was a calculating fraud made my stomach turn. He loved her. He was building his life around her. To destroy that would destroy him, and I could not bear to cause him that pain. Not yet. Not until I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. I opened my portfolio and removed the freshly signed will. The document was 23 pages long, meticulously detailed, leaving my entire estate to my son, with certain provisions for his future children. Standard, expected, exactly what any mother in my position would do. Except now I knew that these pages represented not an act of love, but the successful completion of a con game. Mission accomplished, she had said. By this time next year, we'll have control of the entire estate. Who was we? Was my son part of this? The thought made me physically ill. No, I refused to believe it. I had raised that boy. I knew his character, his integrity, his fundamental decency. He was not capable of this level of deception, which meant she was manipulating him too, using him as a pawn in whatever game she was playing. But who else was involved? A partner, family members, some boyfriend she had kept hidden? The possibilities multiplied in my mind like cancer cells, each one more disturbing than the last. I stood and walked to the window, looking out over the back garden where we had held my son's graduation party, where we had celebrated countless birthdays and holidays, where I had imagined one day watching my grandchildren play. The Japanese maple my husband had planted was now 15 feet tall, its red leaves brilliant in the late afternoon light. That tree had grown from a sapling, nurtured and protected, just as I had nurtured and protected my family's legacy. And now, someone was trying to steal it all. The anger came then, hot and sharp, replacing the shock and grief with something harder and more useful. I had not survived 72 years in this world by being weak. I had not built a substantial estate by being careless. I had not protected my family through market crashes and recessions and personal tragedies by giving up when things became difficult. If this woman thought I was just a sentimental old fool who would roll over and die on schedule, she was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. I returned to my desk and pulled out a yellow legal pad, the same kind my husband had always used for his planning. At the top of the page, I wrote 3 words: what I know. Underneath, I began to list the facts. She had said mission accomplished after I signed the new will. She had mentioned control of the entire estate by this time next year. She had referred to my constant interference. She had someone working with her, someone she reported to or collaborated with. She believed my son was unaware of her true intentions. The pregnancy announcement had been strategically timed. Each fact led to new questions, new avenues of investigation. If she planned to have control within a year, what was supposed to happen to me? The question hung in the air like poison gas. Was I meant to have an accident, a sudden illness, or was she simply counting on the natural actuarial tables, betting that a woman my age would not last much longer? The cruelty of that thought cut deep. I was healthy, active, mentally sharp. My own mother had lived to 93. I had every expectation of at least another decade, perhaps 2, but clearly she had other plans. I started a second list. What I need to find out. Who is she really? Background check, investigation into her past before she met my son. Who is she working with? Phone records, surveillance, identification of co-conspirators. What is the specific plan for gaining control? Legal maneuvering, my incapacitation, or something worse? Does my son know anything? Careful observation without revealing my knowledge. How long has this been planned? Timeline of her relationship with my son, identification of when the con began. What other lies has she told? Verification of everything I thought I knew about her. The act of making these lists calmed me, gave structure to my rage and fear. This was now a problem to be solved, an enemy to be defeated, a war to be won. And I had resources she could not possibly anticipate. I had wealth, connections, legal expertise, and most importantly, I had the element of surprise. She thought the old woman had been successfully fooled. She had no idea the old woman had overheard everything and was now preparing for battle. The phone on my desk rang, startling me out of my tactical planning. The caller ID showed my son's number. For a moment, I considered not answering, not trusting my voice to remain steady, but that would be unusual and might raise suspicions. I picked up after the third ring, forcing warmth into my tone. "Hello, darling." His voice was cheerful, asking about my day, mentioning that his wife was craving the lemon cake I had made last month and wondering if I might make another one this weekend. The casual domesticity of the request was jarring, given what I now knew. I agreed, of course, told him I would be delighted, asked about his work and her pregnancy symptoms, and all the normal things a loving mother and grandmother to be would ask. He suspected nothing. When he mentioned that they were hoping to stop by tomorrow afternoon to discuss some plans for the nursery, I felt my chest tighten. She would be in my home again, smiling and lying and pretending, and I would have to smile back, pretend I knew nothing, play the role she expected of me. Could I do it? Could I look at her face knowing what I knew? I told him tomorrow afternoon would be perfect, that I looked forward to seeing them both. When I hung up, my hands were shaking again. The grandfather clock chimed 6. In less than 24 hours, she would be here, and the performance of my life would begin. I spent that evening in my study, researching private investigators on my computer. I needed someone discreet, someone with experience in complex fraud cases, someone who understood that this required delicacy and absolute confidentiality. I found a firm that specialized in family investigations, read through their credentials and testimonials, and made a note to call first thing in the morning. Then I searched for the best attorney in town for estate litigation and asset protection, someone who could help me understand my legal options for undoing what I had just done in that lawyer's office. The will was signed, but surely there were ways to modify it, to add protections. to ensure that even if something happened to me, she would not get her hands on my family's legacy. As the night deepened and the house settled into its familiar creaks and sighs, I sat in the dim light of my desk lamp and thought about the different types of betrayal. There is the betrayal of a spouse, which I had mercifully never experienced in my 40-year marriage. There is the betrayal of a friend, which stings but can be survived. But the betrayal of family, or someone you welcomed as family, someone you trusted with your most precious relationships and your most vulnerable hopes, that betrayal reaches into the very foundation of who you are and tries to crack it apart. She had not just tried to steal money. She had stolen 3 years of my emotional life, had turned my joy at gaining a daughter into a weapon against me, had corrupted my love for my son and my excitement for my grandchild. Every memory of the past 3 years was now tainted. Every conversation we had shared was now revealed as manipulation. Every gesture of affection had been calculated for effect. The woman I thought I knew did not exist and had never existed. I was grieving for a ghost, but grief is a luxury I could not afford. Not yet. Right now, I needed to be sharp, strategic, ruthless in my own way. I needed to think like my husband would have thought, to plan like the businesswoman I had been before I retired, to protect what was mine with every tool at my disposal. I would smile at her tomorrow. I would serve tea and discuss paint colors for the nursery. I would play the doting grandmother and the trusting mother-in-law. And while I played that role, I would be watching her every gesture, listening to her every word, cataloging every inconsistency and lie. She had underestimated me profoundly. That would be her fatal mistake. The clock struck midnight, and I finally closed my notebook and turned off the desk lamp. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I passed the family photographs lining the wall: my wedding day, my son's birth, vacations and holidays and milestones, all captured in silver frames. In the most recent photo, taken just 6 months ago, the four of us stood together at a charity gala, my son and his wife flanking me, all of us smiling for the camera. She wore a green silk gown I had helped her pick out, and her hand rested on my arm with apparent affection. Looking at that photo now, I could see what I had missed before. Her smile did not quite reach her eyes. Her posture was slightly angled away from me even as she touched my arm, and if I looked very carefully, I could see the faintest expression of calculation in her face, as though she were already counting the money she would inherit. How had I been so blind? I continued to my bedroom and prepared for sleep, though I knew rest would be elusive. Tomorrow would require a performance worthy of an award, and I needed to be ready. As I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, I made myself a promise. Whatever it took, however long it required, I would expose the truth. I would protect my son from this predator. I would ensure that my family's legacy stayed in the family. And I would make certain that anyone who thought they could manipulate and betray me would learn the cost of that mistake. She had said mission accomplished, but the mission was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Sleep finally came in shallow waves, my dreams filled with shifting faces and echoing voices, with documents that turned to ash in my hands and houses that collapsed like cardboard. I woke at dawn, feeling unrested but determined, the way soldiers must feel before battle. The morning light filtered through my bedroom curtains, soft and golden, promising a beautiful day. The irony was not lost on me. I went through my usual routine with mechanical precision: shower, dress, breakfast, at the small table in my kitchen where I could look out at the garden. My housekeeper arrived at 8 and began her daily tasks, unaware that anything had changed. I smiled at her, asked about her daughter's new job, commented on the lovely weather. Normal. Everything had to appear completely normal. At 9 o'clock, I called the private investigation firm. The woman who answered was professional and reassuring, and within 10 minutes, I had an appointment for later that afternoon, after my son and his wife would have left. I explained in vague terms that I needed background verification on someone close to the family, that discretion was paramount, that cost was not a concern. She assured me they understood and dealt with such matters routinely. One call down, one to go. The estate attorney was harder to reach, But I left a detailed message with his secretary explaining that I needed to discuss modifications to the documents I had signed yesterday, that new information had come to light, that this was urgent but confidential. He called back within the hour, his voice concerned. In all the years he had handled my affairs, I had never sounded so serious. We scheduled a meeting for the following morning. By noon, I had the framework of my counterattack in place: private investigator to uncover the truth about her past and present, attorney to help me protect my assets and modify my estate plan, and my own observation to gather real time intelligence on what she was planning. Three prongs of defense and offense, each one necessary, each one requiring careful management. I spent the early afternoon preparing for their visit. I baked the lemon cake my son had requested, filling the house with the scent of citrus and vanilla. I arranged fresh flowers in the living room. I set the table in the sunroom with my good china and the tea service that had been my mother's. Every detail perfect, every element designed to project warmth and normalcy and the loving welcome of a doting mother and grandmother. When the doorbell rang at 3 o'clock, I checked my appearance in the hall mirror one final time. Pearls, soft blue cashmere sweater, tailored slacks, my hair freshly styled. The picture of elegant, gracious maturity, the picture of an easy target. I opened the door with a smile that felt like it might crack my face. My son embraced me first, as he always did, and the familiar scent of his cologne brought unexpected tears to my eyes. This, at least, was real. His love for me, my love for him, that had not been corrupted. Not yet. Then she stepped forward, and I had to force myself not to recoil. She wore a flowing dress that emphasized her pregnancy, her hand resting on the small bump in that universally recognized gesture of expectant mothers. Her smile was warm, her eyes bright, her manner affectionate as she kissed my cheek and complimented the flowers. "Hello, Mother. I heard you had an exciting day yesterday at the lawyer's office. Thank you so much for taking care of all that. It means the world to us to know everything is arranged properly." The words were innocuous, appropriate, exactly what a grateful daughter-in-law should say. But I heard the subtext now, the hidden meaning in every syllable. Thank you for signing over your estate. Thank you for making our con so easy. Thank you for being the fool we needed you to be. I ushered them into the sunroom, poured tea, served the lemon cake, and listened as they discussed their plans for the nursery. She wanted a specific designer whose fees were astronomical. They were considering hiring a night nurse for the first 6 months. They had looked at a larger house in a more exclusive neighborhood. Every plan involved significant expense, and every expense was presented with the casual assumption that I would help fund it. I had always been generous with them. Now, I understood that my generosity had not been appreciated but expected, not seen as love but as evidence of my exploitability. My son, bless him, seemed slightly uncomfortable with some of her more extravagant suggestions, but she smoothed over his concerns with practiced ease. "We want the best for the baby," she said, resting her hand on his arm. "Your mother understands that, don't you, Mother?" She looked at me with those clear, innocent eyes, and I looked back with equal innocence and nodded. "Of course, darling. Only the best for my grandchild. Nothing is too good for family." Something flickered in her expression then, so quickly I might have imagined it. Satisfaction, contempt. It was gone before I could be certain, replaced by that warm smile I'd seen 1,000 times. The conversation drifted to other topics. My son's work was going well. They were planning a baby moon vacation before the pregnancy progressed too far. She wondered if I might want to join them for a day of shopping next week to look at baby furniture. Every word, every gesture, every smile was part of the performance. And now that I knew I was watching a performance, I could see the edges where the mask did not quite fit. She was good, I had to give her that. Skilled and practiced and convincing. But she had made one critical error. She had let me hear the truth. After an hour, they prepared to leave. My son hugged me again, thanking me for the cake and the tea and the good company. She embraced me as well, and I felt her hand linger on my shoulder in what anyone else would read as affection. "See you next week, Mother. We can finalize some of those nursery plans. Maybe you could come by our place for dinner. I would love to cook for you." Another perfect touch, the devoted wife who wants to care for her mother in law, who wants to include her in their lives, who values family connection. I agreed, of course, and told her I looked forward to it. When the door closed behind them and I heard their car pull away, I remained standing in the foyer for a long moment, my smile finally fading, my carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. The effort of that performance had been immense, and I felt suddenly exhausted, drained by the necessity of pretending everything was fine when my entire world had been revealed as a lie. But I could not afford exhaustion. I had a meeting with the private investigator in 2 hours, and I needed to be sharp and clear and ready to provide every detail that might help uncover the truth. I returned to my study and retrieved the notebook where I had been compiling information. 3 years of memories, now viewed through the lens of suspicion. When did she and my son meet? At a charity fundraiser I had helped organize. Coincidence, or had she targeted him specifically? Where did she claim to be from? A small town in another state, family deceased, few connections to her past. Convenient or deliberately constructed to be unverifiable. What did she do for work before marrying my son? Something vague in marketing, a job she quit soon after the wedding to focus on starting a family, or to focus on managing her real job, which was conning me. Every detail I had accepted at face value now seemed potentially false, every story possibly a lie. The investigator's office was in a nondescript building downtown, deliberately unremarkable. The receptionist led me to a private conference room where a woman in her 40s greeted me with a firm handshake and an assessing gaze. She introduced herself, and we sat across from each other at a polished table while she pulled out a laptop and a legal pad. "Tell me everything," she said simply, and I did. I started with the overheard phone call and worked backward through 3 years of relationship, highlighting anything that now seemed suspicious or inconsistent. She took notes, asked clarifying questions, and did not judge or express shock at any of my suspicions. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, reviewing her notes. Then she looked up at me with a professional sympathy that was somehow more comforting than false reassurance would have been. "What you're describing fits a pattern we see in long term financial exploitation cases. Someone targets an individual with assets, builds a relationship over time, gains trust, and then positions themselves to inherit or control those assets. The pregnancy, if it's real, is often used as an additional emotional lever. The fact that she has someone she reports to suggests this may be part of a larger operation." I felt my blood run cold. A larger operation. As if my family was just one mark among many, one successful con in a string of successful cons. She continued explaining the process. They would run a complete background check, looking for any inconsistencies in her history. They would investigate her financial records, looking for unexplained income or connections to other individuals. They would conduct surveillance to identify her associates and activities. And they would do all of this quietly, carefully, ensuring that she had no idea she was being investigated. "How long will it take?" I asked. She considered. "For a preliminary report, probably 2 weeks. For a comprehensive investigation, 4 to 6 weeks. We'll start with the basics and see what we find. Sometimes these cases unravel quickly once you start pulling the threads." I authorized them to begin immediately, signed the necessary paperwork, and wrote a substantial check for the retainer. Money I had been prepared to leave to my son was now being spent to protect him from the woman he loved. The irony was bitter. When I left the investigator's office, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The beauty of it seemed almost mocking. How could the world look so lovely when everything in my personal life had turned ugly? I drove home slowly, my mind already shifting to the next day's meeting with my attorney. I needed to understand my legal options for protecting the estate, for modifying the will I had just signed, for ensuring that even if something happened to me, she would not benefit. The house was dark when I arrived, my housekeeper long gone for the day. I turned on lights as I moved through the rooms, pushing back the shadows, refusing to let the darkness feel oppressive. This was still my home, still my sanctuary, still my fortress, and I would defend it. I made a simple dinner, poured a glass of wine, and sat in my study, reviewing the notes I would discuss with the attorney tomorrow. The legal language of wills and trusts and estate planning had always seemed dry and boring before. Now it read like a battle plan, each clause and provision a potential weapon or shield. I thought about my husband, about how he had built this estate with intelligence and hard work and careful planning. He had trusted me to protect it after he was gone, to preserve it for our son and future generations. I had nearly betrayed that trust, had nearly handed everything to a woman who saw it only as a prize to be won. But I had been given a chance, a lucky accident of being in the right place at the wrong time, of overhearing words not meant for my ears. Some might call it providence, some might call it fate. I called it a warning, and I intended to heed it. That night I slept better than I had the previous night, not because the situation had improved, but because I had begun to take action. Passivity and shock had given way to strategy and determination. I was no longer a victim discovering betrayal. I was a general planning a campaign. The next morning, my attorney greeted me in his office with concern evident in his expression. We had worked together for 15 years, and he knew me well enough to recognize when something was seriously wrong. I sat in the leather chair across from his desk and, with as much composure as I could manage, told him what I had overheard. His reaction was immediate and gratifying. He was horrified, angry on my behalf, and immediately focused on solutions. First, he explained, the will I had signed 2 days ago was valid, but wills could be modified or completely rewritten at any time as long as I had mental capacity, which clearly I did. We could draft a new will immediately, adding trust provisions that would protect assets, requiring certain conditions to be met before distributions, even including contest clauses that would disinherit anyone who challenged the document. Second, we could establish additional trusts, moving assets out of my personal estate and into protected structures that would be managed by independent trustees. This would reduce what I actually owned at the time of my death, limiting what could be inherited. Third, we could add medical directives and power of attorney documents that would prevent anyone from making financial or medical decisions on my behalf without oversight from multiple independent parties. This would protect against scenarios where I might be incapacitated and vulnerable to manipulation. Each suggestion was like armor being fitted to a warrior. Each legal strategy was a defense against the attack I now knew was coming. We spent 3 hours going through options, drafting new documents, creating layers of protection that would make it virtually impossible for her to access my estate, even if the worst happened. When I finally left his office, I carried a folder full of new paperwork to be signed and finalized over the coming weeks. The process of dismantling the will I had signed 2 days ago and replacing it with something far more protective was underway. One more piece of the defense in place. Over the following 2 weeks, I maintained my normal routine with careful precision. I had lunch with friends, attended my book club, volunteered at the hospital auxiliary. Everything normal, everything unremarkable, nothing to suggest that underneath the calm surface I was preparing for war. My son and his wife invited me to dinner at their home, as she had suggested. I went, smiled, admired the nursery they were preparing, and listened to their excited chatter about names and parenting philosophies. She served a meal she claimed to have prepared herself, though I recognized the containers in the recycling from an expensive catering company, another small lie, meaningless in itself but part of the larger pattern of deception. During that dinner, my son mentioned that they had been discussing the possibility of me moving closer to them after the baby was born, perhaps selling my large house and buying something smaller and more manageable nearby. It would be so much easier for us to help you, and you could see the baby every day, she said, with apparent enthusiasm. Your house is really too big for one person, and the upkeep must be exhausting. I deflected gracefully, saying I would think about it, that it was sweet of them to worry about me. But I understood what she was really suggesting. Get me out of my house, my fortress, my seat of power. Isolate me, make me dependent on them, reduce my resources and independence. The Khan was advancing, becoming more aggressive now that she believed the will was signed and the legal structures in place. If I had not overheard that phone call, I might have actually considered her suggestion. I might have seen it as loving concern rather than strategic positioning. The thought of how close I had come to walking into her trap made me feel physically ill. 2 weeks after my initial meeting with the private investigator, she called to say she had preliminary findings and would like to meet. I drove to her office the next morning with my heart pounding. This was the moment when suspicion would either be confirmed or revealed as paranoid fantasy. Part of me hoped for the latter. Part of me wanted to be wrong, wanted to discover that I had misheard or misunderstood, that my family was intact and my daughter in law was genuine. But the larger part of me, the part that had heard the coldness in her voice and the calculation in her words, knew better. The investigator greeted me and laid out a series of documents on the conference table. Her expression was serious, and I knew before she spoke that my worst fears were about to be confirmed. The woman you know has a history. She paused, choosing her words carefully. This is not her first time using marriage and pregnancy to gain access to wealth. Over the next hour, I learned the truth about the woman I had welcomed as a daughter. Her name was not what she had told us. She had changed it legally 5 years ago, erasing her previous identity. Before she met my son, she had been engaged to another wealthy man in another city, that engagement ending abruptly after she was caught attempting to forge his signature on financial documents. No charges were filed because the man wanted to avoid scandal, but she had been forced to leave town. Before that, she had been involved in at least two other relationships with affluent older men, both of which ended with unexplained transfers of money or property. Her supposed dead family was actually alive and estranged, having cut ties with her years ago after she stole from them. The small town she claimed to be from was a lie. Her work history was fabricated. Even the pregnancy, while apparently real based on medical records the investigator had obtained, had been announced at a suspiciously strategic time. Just weeks before, she began pressuring my son to have me update my estate planning. And most damning, the investigator had identified her co conspirator, a man she had known for years, possibly a romantic partner, possibly just a criminal associate. He lived 2 states away, but traveled frequently to our city, staying in hotels, and meeting with her while my son was at work. Phone records showed constant communication between them, including the call I had overheard that day at the lawyer's office. She had a pattern, a system, a proven method for identifying and exploiting wealthy targets. And my son had been her biggest success yet. I sat in that conference room staring at photographs and documents and phone records, and I felt something inside me turn to steel. This was no longer about protecting my estate. This was about saving my son from a predator who had selected him deliberately, who had seduced him methodically, who was using him as a tool to access money she had not earned and did not deserve. The investigator watched me process this information with professional sympathy. I know this is difficult, but now you have options. You have evidence. You can act. I looked up at her, and I knew my expression had hardened into something she recognized. She'd seen it before in other victims who had learned the truth and decided to fight back. What do you recommend? She leaned forward. Document everything. Continue the investigation to build an even stronger case. Consult with your attorney about the best way to protect your assets and your son. And when the time is right, expose the truth in a way that is undeniable and leaves her no room to manipulate or lie her way out. We need to think several moves ahead. She's good at this, and she will not go down easily. I nodded slowly. How long until you have a comprehensive report? Another 2 weeks for the full documented case. We will have photographs, financial records, interview statements from people in her past, everything you need. I can wait 2 weeks. I had waited 3 years already, living in ignorance. 2 more weeks of pretending was nothing. When I left the investigator's office, I felt different. The grief and shock of the past 2 weeks had been processed and transformed into cold determination. I had entered this fight on the defensive, reacting to a betrayal I had accidentally discovered, but now I was moving to offense, and when I struck, it would be with precision and overwhelming force. That evening, my son called to chat. His voice was cheerful, talking about baby names and nursery colors, and how excited he was to be a father. I listened and made appropriate responses and felt my heart break for him. He had no idea he was building his life on a foundation of lies, and when the truth came out, it would devastate him. But better devastated now than destroyed later. Better to suffer the pain of truth than continue living in a comfortable deception that would eventually consume everything he had. I slept deeply that night, the sleep of someone who has made a decision and committed to seeing it through. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange duality. On the surface, life continued normally. I had lunch with friends, attended my book club, worked in my garden, and played the role of the contented grandmother to be. But underneath, I was preparing. The investigator continued her work, digging deeper, building the case. My attorney finalized the new estate documents, creating legal structures that would protect everything I had built, and I began planning how to reveal the truth. This could not be a private conversation that she could deny or twist. It could not be a family confrontation where her lies could be accepted over my evidence. This needed to be definitive, public enough that there was no escape, and structured in a way that would protect my son even as it destroyed his illusions. I considered and rejected several approaches. A family intervention would be too easy to manipulate. Simply presenting my son with the evidence privately would allow her to spin it as a jealous mother trying to break them apart. Going to the police would require criminal charges that might or might not stick, and the legal process could take years. No, this needed to be something else. Something that would expose her completely while giving my son no choice but to face the truth. The answer came to me 2 days before the investigator's final report was due. We had a large family gathering planned for the following month, a celebration for what would have been my late husband's birthday. It was an annual tradition attended by extended family, close friends, business associates who had become like family over the years. 50 or 60 people all gathered in my home, all witnesses. That would be the moment. That would be when the truth came out, not as an accusation, but as a revelation, supported by undeniable evidence, delivered in front of enough people that she could not contain or control the narrative. I called the investigator and told her the timeline. She understood immediately and agreed to have everything ready. I called my attorney and explained the plan. He was initially concerned about the public nature of the exposure, but I convinced him that this was the only way to protect my son from her manipulation. If the truth came out in front of the family, if everyone saw the evidence at once, she would have no opportunity to isolate my son and convince him that I was lying or delusional. The pieces were falling into place. The trap was being set, and she had no idea that the foolish old woman she had so successfully conned was about to become her worst nightmare. The day of the celebration arrived with perfect weather, sunny and warm, with a light breeze that carried the scent of roses from my garden. The caterers arrived early to set up, and my housekeeper had spent the previous day ensuring every room was spotless. By late afternoon, the house was filled with family and friends, their voices and laughter echoing through the rooms, as they had done at so many gatherings over the years. My son and his wife arrived fashionably late, her pregnancy now obvious at 6 months, her hand protectively cradling the bump as she accepted congratulations and cooed over baby gifts that people had brought. She wore a flowing dress in cream, looking radiant and maternal and completely at ease. She moved through the rooms greeting people, accepting embraces, playing the role of beloved family member with the skill of a professional actress. I watched from across the room as she touched my son's arm, as she smiled at the guests, as she subtly steered conversations toward their future plans and the baby's arrival. Every gesture calculated, every word chosen for effect. She was magnificent in her deception. It was almost a shame to destroy her. Almost. As the afternoon progressed into evening and people gathered in the living room for the traditional toast to my late husband's memory, I caught the eye of my attorney standing near the fireplace. He nodded slightly. Everything was ready. The investigator had arrived an hour earlier, blending in with the other guests, her presence unremarked. In my study, concealed in a locked drawer, was a comprehensive folder containing every piece of evidence we had gathered: photographs, financial records, background reports, phone logs, interviews from her previous victims. The truth, documented and undeniable. I moved to the front of the room and raised my hand for quiet. The conversations died down, and people turned to face me with expectant smiles. This was normally when I gave a brief speech about my husband, shared a favorite memory, and led a toast. Tonight would be different. I began, as I always did, talking about my husband, his integrity, his business acumen, his devotion to family. I spoke about how he had built our life through hard work and careful planning, how he had always protected what was ours, how he had taught me to value truth and honesty above all things. The room was quiet, attentive. My son stood near the window, his wife beside him, both of them smiling at my words. Then I shifted direction. My husband also taught me to be vigilant, to recognize when someone was not what they seemed, to protect our family's legacy from those who would try to take it through deception rather than earning it honestly. A few people shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in tone, but not yet understanding where this was going. My son frowned slightly, confused. His wife's smile remained fixed, but I saw her eyes sharpen with the first hint of concern. I turned to look directly at her, which is why I am grateful that 2 weeks after I updated my will, I happened to overhear a phone conversation that revealed the truth about someone I had trusted completely, someone I had welcomed as a daughter, someone who saw my family not as people to love, but as marks to be exploited. The room went deadly silent. My son's face registered shock and confusion. His wife went very still, her smile frozen in place, her hand tightening on his arm. Before anyone could speak, before she could interrupt or deflect, I nodded to my attorney. He stepped forward with the folder and began handing out copies of key documents to the people nearest him. As I speak, you are receiving evidence of a systematic con game that has been perpetrated against my family for the past 3 years. The woman you know as my daughter-in-law is not who she claims to be. Her name is false. Her background is fabricated. Her previous relationships have followed the same pattern of financial exploitation, and her current pregnancy, while real, was strategically timed to maximize emotional manipulation and access to my estate. I watched her face as I spoke. The frozen smile melted into shock, then panic, then desperate calculation. She looked at the documents being distributed, at the people reading them with growing horror, at my son who stood beside her with an expression of complete bewilderment. This is insane. She finally found her voice, high and strained. She's obviously confused, maybe suffering from some kind of dementia. This is outrageous and hurtful, and I cannot believe she would make these accusations. I remained calm. The investigator standing near the back of the room stepped forward, introducing herself and her credentials. She explained the investigation's scope, the evidence gathered, the previous victims identified. As she spoke, more people in the room pulled out their phones, looking up the documentation that had been posted to a secure website I had created for this purpose. Everything was there. Everything was public. Everything was undeniable. My son stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track: confusion, denial, anger, betrayal, grief. He looked at his wife, at me, at the documents in his hands, unable to process what was happening. She made one last attempt. She turned to him, tears streaming down her face, her hand on her pregnant belly. "You cannot believe this. She's trying to break us apart because she's jealous, because she cannot stand that you love me, because she wants to control your life. I love you. Our baby is real. This is all lies." But my son was reading the documents. He was looking at photographs of her with another man. He was seeing her real name, her real background, the truth about who she was. And I saw the moment when belief died in his eyes, when the woman he loved was revealed as a fiction, when his entire life for the past 3 years was exposed as a lie. The room erupted in noise, people shouting questions, her trying to push through the crowd toward the door, my attorney blocking her path, my son sinking into a chair with his head in his hands. It was chaos and pain, and the ugly exposure of truth that had been hidden too long. But it was necessary. Through the noise, I heard her scream at me. "You're a bitter old woman who couldn't stand to see me happy, who couldn't stand that your son chose me over you. You've destroyed everything out of petty jealousy." I walked closer to her, close enough that only those immediately around us could hear, and I spoke with a voice cold as winter. "You chose to target my family. You chose to lie, manipulate, and exploit. You chose to see my love as weakness and my trust as stupidity. This destruction is your own work. I simply made sure everyone could see what you really are. She lunged at me then, and several people grabbed her, holding her back. She was screaming, crying, her carefully maintained facade completely shattered, revealing the desperate con artist underneath. Security personnel I had hired for the event moved in and escorted her from the house as she screamed threats and accusations. The door closed behind her, and she was gone. The room slowly quieted. People stood in shocked clusters, reading documents, talking in hushed voices, trying to process what had just happened. My son remained in the chair, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I went to him and knelt beside him, placing my hand on his knee. I am so sorry, my darling boy. I am so sorry you had to learn this way, but I could not let her destroy you. I could not let her take everything we have built. I love you too much. He looked up at me with red, devastated eyes. Is the baby even mine? The question hung in the air like a knife. I don't know. We can find out if you want to. But right now, what matters is that you are safe, and our family is protected, and the truth is known. He collapsed forward, and I held him as he wept, this grown man reduced to the heartbroken boy he had been so long ago when his father died. Around us, family members began to approach, offering support, expressing shock and sympathy, united in their protection of him. The celebration of my husband's birthday had become something very different, but I thought he would have approved. He had always valued truth over comfort, protection over politeness. He would have done exactly what I had done. As the evening wound down and people slowly departed, each of them stopping to embrace me or my son, I felt the weight of the past month begin to lift. The battle was over. The war was won. She was exposed and exiled, her con game revealed, her ability to harm my family destroyed. The attorney approached me as the last guests were leaving. That was one of the most dramatic things I've ever witnessed in my career. But it was effective. She has no legal ground to stand on, and with this many witnesses to the exposure, she cannot claim you defamed her. Well done. After everyone had gone and my son had finally left to go home to the apartment he had shared with her, an apartment he would need to abandon now, I stood alone in my living room. The catering staff had cleaned up. The evidence folders had been collected. The house was quiet again, but it was a different quiet than before. It was the quiet of peace after battle, of safety after threat, of truth after deception. I walked through the rooms, turning off lights, and found myself once again in my study, standing before my husband's portrait. I had protected what we built. I had saved our son. I had proven that underestimating a woman of 72 years simply because she was old and supposedly sentimental was a fatal mistake. The phone rang. It was my son. His voice was raw from crying, but steadier than it had been earlier. Mom, I need to know. How did you figure it out? How did you know? I told him about the overheard phone call, about the luck or providence that had put me in the right place at the exact moment I needed to hear the truth. I told him about the investigation, the evidence gathering, the careful planning, and I told him that I had done it all because I loved him more than anything in this world. He was quiet for a long moment. Thank you. I don't know how I'm going to get through this, but thank you for saving me from something so much worse. We talked for an hour, and I heard him begin to process, to grieve, to slowly accept the reality of what had happened. It would take time. He would need therapy, support, probably a good lawyer to handle the divorce and determine paternity of the child, but he would survive. He was stronger than he knew, and he had family who loved him genuinely, not for what they could take, but for who he was. When I finally hung up and climbed the stairs to bed, I felt exhausted but satisfied. The battle had been won, but the war's aftermath would continue for some time. Legal proceedings, family healing, my son's recovery from this betrayal. But the worst was over. She was gone. The threat was neutralized. My family's legacy was protected. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about the twists of fate that had led to this outcome. If I had left the lawyer's office 5 minutes earlier or later, I would never have heard that phone call. If I had not been standing in exactly the right spot, I would have missed her words. If she had been slightly more careful, slightly more paranoid, she might have noticed me before saying what she said, but she had not. And that small moment of carelessness had unraveled 3 years of careful planning. In the darkness, I smiled. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of rebuilding, of helping my son heal, of ensuring the legal protections I had put in place were ironclad. Tomorrow, I would move forward, but tonight I allowed myself to feel the triumph of a war well fought and decisively won. Mission accomplished, she had said. But the real mission, the mission of protecting my family and preserving my late husband's legacy, that mission was mine, and I had accomplished it thoroughly. The weeks that followed were difficult, but necessary. My son filed for divorce, and the legal proceedings began. DNA testing was arranged for after the baby's birth. Her co conspirator was identified and investigated by authorities. The man she had been working with had outstanding warrants in 2 states, and their whole operation began to crumble under scrutiny. She tried to fight back, hiring a lawyer and claiming she had been victimized by a wealthy family who refused to accept her. But the evidence was too strong, the documentation too thorough. Her previous victims, encouraged by our successful exposure, came forward with their own stories. A pattern emerged that was impossible to deny. My son struggled. Some days were better than others. He threw himself into his work, leaned on friends, started therapy. Slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild his sense of self and his ability to trust. When the baby was born, the DNA test confirmed what we had suspected. The child was not my son's. It was the co-conspirators, conceived deliberately as part of the con to create an unbreakable tie to my family and estate. The divorce was finalized quickly after that with no contest. She took her child and disappeared, last I heard, moving to another state to try her schemes elsewhere. But now she had a record, a documented history, a trail of exposure that would make future cons much more difficult. My son grieved the loss of what he thought he had, the wife and child and future that had never been real. But gradually, very gradually, he began to heal. A year after the exposure, he started dating again. This time, he was more cautious, more careful, more aware of red flags. And I, having learned my lesson about blind trust, made sure to quietly investigate anyone who became serious in his life. Not because I wanted to control him, but because I had learned that protecting family sometimes meant being willing to see uncomfortable truths. I updated my will again, this time with even more protections and provisions. I established a foundation in my husband's name to support causes he had cared about. I ensured that when I eventually passed, my estate would be used for good and not fall into the hands of another con artist. 2 years after that dramatic birthday celebration, my son met someone new. She was kind, genuine, with a career of her own, and no interest in my money. They dated slowly, building trust carefully. When he finally brought her to meet me, I saw in his eyes that he had healed enough to hope again. I welcomed her warmly, but I also watched carefully. Once betrayed, forever vigilant, but she passed every test, overt and subtle. She was real. And when they married 3 years later, it was with joy unmarred by hidden agendas. As I stood at their wedding, watching my son smile with genuine happiness, I thought about that day in the lawyer's office, about the phone call I had overheard, about the choice I had made to fight rather than accept the betrayal. If I had done nothing, if I had remained ignorant or chosen to ignore what I heard, this day would never have come. My son would still be trapped in a false marriage with a woman who saw him only as a means to wealth. Our family's legacy would be in the hands of criminals, and I would have failed in my duty to protect what my husband and I had built. But I had not done nothing. I had fought back with every resource at my disposal, with intelligence and strategy and determination. And I had won, not just for myself, but for my son, for my family, for the legacy that would now pass to genuine heirs who would value it properly. The old woman they had called a sentimental fool had proven to be anything but. I had shown them, as I hope this story shows anyone who hears it, that underestimating someone because of their age or their kindness is a mistake. That trust, once broken, can be transformed into the sharpest of weapons. That love for family can make even the gentlest person fierce. And that justice, when it finally comes, is sweet indeed. Did you like the story, and which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see two new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.